It started out as a typical day for the Warren family living on this quiet street in Wellington, Florida, an equestrian community just north of Miami.
That morning, I do remember we were eating breakfast. Nice, calm Saturday, I believe it was.
Joe Aarons was 21 years old at the time. He will remember that Saturday for the rest of his life. It was May 26, 1990. A clown carrying balloons and flowers came to the Aarons' door. Joe's mom, Marlene Aarons Warren, reached for the flowers and was fatally shot twice in the face.
It was one of the worst days of my life.
Aarons heard the gunfire and ran to find his mother in a pool of blood. He saw the clown walk away and disappear into a white car, but had no clue who the killer was, and neither did police. The case would go cold for decades. Then, finally, after 27 years, a break. Advanced DNA testing led authorities to Sheila Keene Warren.
Testing has evolved over time, and there were apparently some pieces of evidence that they wanted to re-examine, and they sent it to an FBI lab. And it's unclear which part of that led to the arrest, but something stuck. And that's how they were able to make the arrest.
Keene Warren was living in Virginia. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder for the shooting death of Joe Aaron's mother, Marlene Warren.
I could not grieve because there was no closure in the case.
Authorities suspected Sheila was having an affair with Marlene's husband, Michael Warren. Michael and Sheila eventually married in 2002. She was living with him at the time of her arrest. The trail that led investigators to Sheila Keene Warren contained many twists. One of them, a deathbed confession from John Moran, a family friend. John Moran passed away, but before he died, he shared a secret with his son, John Moran Jr.
My father told me everything that happened before he died. I knew where the car was. I knew who planned it. I knew where the gun was at.
John Moran Sr. worked with Michael Warren, who was married to the victim. Warren was questioned by police but never charged in his wife's murder. He was a used car dealer who was later arrested on charges of grand theft, odometer, tampering, and racketeering. Warren's friend, John Moran, told his son before he died that Warren may have had something to do with his wife's death.
On his deathbed, he told me that car would get me anything I ever wanted from Mike Warren.
Moran Jr. told detectives that Michael Warren tried to bribe him. Investigators followed up on details Moran Jr. gave them, including information about what could have been the killer clown's getaway car. John Moran Jr. said his dad told him where some of the evidence was kept. Police went diving in a Palm Beach canal where Moran Jr. says he and his father helped dump the evidence. However, investigators did not find the clown costume or murder weapon. Without that evidence, police can't make a case for murder against Sheila Keene Warren, according to their lawyer.
I do know enough about this case, not from the discovery process, but from my knowledge of the case, that she's innocent.
What a case. I mean, this is an unreal case, but it's 30 years old, and that's a problem, right? You don't have all the evidence. That's a problem, but maybe you can put some of the pieces together here. Let's bring in our guest, joining us from Tampa, Florida, criminal defense attorney Teresa Jean-Pierre Coy, and you may recognize her, Court TV viewers, from a trial that we covered down in Tampa involving a man named Michael Draka. Great to have you on the program, Teresa. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to see you. Let's start first with, this was 30 years ago, and the killer was a clown. How much of an advantage does the defense have here with the age of the case and no clown costume, no clown car to be found?
Listen, I think the defense has a great advantage in the case. As you said, we're talking about 30 years ago. You know, memories fade, evidence fade. I mean, now you're talking about, the defendant in this case, she was 27 at the time. Now she's 57. I think that these things are huge advantages for the defense. And for me, when I first, read about this, the only evidence that they talked about was a clown. They don't even say a male clown, a female clown. So everybody knows in any case, identification is the biggest issue. And I think that, the state is going to have a huge problem with identification. If you can't tell who committed the crime, you really don't have a case. So I think that, the length of this case that it's taken to get to this point, coupled with, no clown costume, and the scant evidence that we've been hearing about is a really great advantage for the defense.
Now, there are some disadvantages. She did marry the victim's husband. And I think for a jury, they kind of look at that and say, okay, what's going on here? Like, why would some of the evidence point to someone like that? And, oh, maybe there's a motive to get the wife out of the way, doing it for the husband. So I see, at least for prosecutors, they've got a story to tell.
Absolutely. There definitely is a story to tell. But at the end of the day, evidence wins cases. And it's the state's burden. They have the burden to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. And while that story may sound great and it sounds like, something that's on a tabloid, at the end of the day, they still need the evidence. I mean, to be quite honest with you, there could be reasons why the husband himself could have been the one that committed the crime, which goes back to the identification of the shooter in this case. And I think, again, without having more evidence and the time that has gone by, I still think that the state is going to have an uphill battle. But they do have a great story. It does make for great, courtroom TV, fodder for us to talk back and forth about. But at the end of the day, the state has the burden. It's beyond reasonable doubt. And right now, they're facing an uphill battle.
Now, I suspect if I was on that jury, right, and I'm hearing the evidence and I'm hearing the prosecution theory, the story, and I'm seeing the dynamics of everything, I want to hear from the victim's husband. I want to hear from the defendant's husband. And it's the same person. Whose advantage is it if they never hear from him, right? If he's this big figure in the story, in the case, in the investigation, but no one ever hears from him. Who gets the advantage, the prosecution or defense there?
That's a tough question. I don't know who would have an advantage from hearing from him. If I was the defense, I don't want to hear from him. I would not put him as a witness on the stand because you have to explain that, right? She was a former employee, and then in 2002, you end up getting married, you leave the state. I don't want him as a witness. And if I'm the state, you already know they're still married. At the time that they arrested her, they were still married. So he's going to come in and he's going to basically say anything or, to support his wife. So that's not a risk that I want to take either if I'm the state. So I think it's just going to be one of those issues where you kind of just leave it, just leave it as a question in the jury's mind and let them kind of think about what they're going to do. But I don't know. I wouldn't want him as a defense attorney.
Let me ask you this. If he shows up at the trial, which side of the courtroom should he sit on?
He's going to sit on his wife's side. I think he's going to go ahead and sit on his wife's side. They were still married.
Which wife?
Well, the one that's still alive. So let's put it that way. But he's going to sit on the side of the defendant because that's who he was still married to. And that's when he's going to support. I don't know any information about his history with his son, throughout these 30 years. I'm really not quite sure. But I think if he comes into the courtroom, he's going to sit on the side of his wife, the defendant. But I will be honest with you. You mentioned me being in the Draker case, last year. There was a decision made for his wife not to be in the courtroom at all. So that's also a possibility. So he may not even show up at all for the entire trial. You just never know.
Teresa Jean-Pierre Coy, great to see you again. Great to have you on the program. Stay well. All right, folks, when we come back, we're still tracking this one. Let me give you the date.